Um, First, let me thank Melanie and all the rest of the organizing team for inviting me here. Great privilege, and it's more of a privilege to be asked to give a keynote address. Thank you very much. I'm going to talk about the work that we do in the Western Cape. I'm not going to preach. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm going to tell you what we did. You can draw whatever conclusions you like. I work in the Cederberg, in the northern Cederberg mostly, in an area we call the Achterpakhuis. It's achter the Pakhuis. It's over and behind the Pakhuis Pass at the northern end of the Cederberg. I first went there in 1966 with Tim Maggs and Chaim Rabinowitz, who showed me the paintings. I'd only been here a few weeks, and I've never left. Those paintings were just amazing and really inspirational, but very enigmatic, as you all know about painting. Very enigmatic. There are endless repetitive visits that one needs to do here. So I start with some thanks. I could have filled the whole page with acknowledgements, actually, but that's the string of people who, over the last few decades, have shown me the paintings, have helped me think about them, record them, and interpret them. We have arrived at a kind of an ontological and phenomenological perspective, as have most rock people in Southern Africa. But that doesn't stop those people arguing with one another, talking about it quite a lot. It's not straightforward, but it is an approach that I think a lot of people are finding is helpful at the moment. I personally, I think I've thought for a long time that the paintings in the Cape, I don't intend my remarks to be necessarily applicable across Southern Africa. Some of them may be, you have to decide. I personally think in the Cape, we're looking at a lot of gender and life history information. We're looking at a lot of selection in the paintings that include human figures. We're looking at a lot of emphasis on influence from, if you like, gender and life history. We're also looking at the creation then of a landscape, because I accept that that our definition of landscape has to be the landscape as lived in people's heads. It's not that thing out there, which could be a topography or an environment or whatever. It's that thing in here. It's very challenging. You might even say cheeky. You might even use a stronger word than that, actually, of archaeologists to think that they can do that. Why do we think that we can understand a topographic framework in the eyes and through the minds of the people who painted it? Why do we think that? Well, quite frankly, you don't have to look very far around anthropology and archaeology to find many, many endeavors like that. I spend a lot of time thinking about the Blake and Lloyd material, and how ambitious to think that one could see the world through those informants, teachers. But we do. We're archaeologists, and we like a challenge, I suppose, or maybe the reasons, but that's my reason. Okay, so and this painting I'll come back to. So this is what we end up with. We started out going to places. We didn't even record them. Maybe we took some photographs, and then we went back to the university. Maybe we had some field notes. Eventually, we rigorized that, and we started recording where the sites were. We developed formal ways of recording the sites. This is what everybody was doing in Southern Africa. And we began to develop an archive. And this is the kind of map that emerged, particularly in that Achterpakhuis area, where there are thousands of painted locations or sites. While we were doing that, we realized that we might as well be recording all sites. So even if there weren't paintings, maybe early Stone Age material, or there were shell middens or whatever, Well, and we ended up with a very large number of dots on a map. We ended up with maps with measles, okay? And that's what they look like. And it's really interesting. And I suppose the first point that I want to make here is that these sites, rock art sites, are very good. This is very useful for telling you where places are. But it's not very useful for telling you what places are. And in fact, we had, I mean, and everybody will have been through these things. We had a lot of debate and discussion about what we were doing. It's clear that by reducing a locality to a dot, you kind of losing a huge amount of information. But nevertheless, in terms of management, it's quite important. We try to, that's Tony Manhire. A lot of you know Tony. Tony was part of our research group, and he was the person who really kept that archive. He was the person who we could rely on to put the dots on the map. Of course, after about 15 years, we realized that many of the dots were not really very accurately placed on the map. You know, when GPS came in, it was really not very useful. It led us to the accuracy of those locations. Anyway, that's what we did, and I think that's what most rock art were doing at the time. The red dots appear very similar and self-contained, but we all know they're very different. None of those. Anybody who had never even been there would learn to distinguish one site from another in half an hour. And what's more, the paintings on the sites are different. So there's a huge amount of variety that's being reduced here to a bunch of dots. So my first suggestion about sites is that we think about the difference between sites and places. And what that means. I'm not a manager of these things. I can't claim to have insights into how to manage. I'm a researcher. I'm interested in why the painters painted what they did, why they painted what they did, where they did, and how that changed through time. That's a standard archaeological kind of approach to all aspects of the archaeological. Right. So how we manage it? Well, I think it's difficult because we were put on the spot very early on because people want to develop, people want to put a dam, people want to build a road, people want to do whatever. And off we went, and then we got this questionnaire: which ones are highly significant, which are moderately significant, which are slightly significant, which ones can we destroy? You know, at the bottom of the list. Terrible to have to answer questions because they're meaningless. Tony and I took different routes. Tony just said everything. You can't do anything. You know, everything's important. No. Whatever you want to do, whatever you want to put down. No. I thought that was a bit extreme, but I understood that it was coming from a deep love of painted material on Tony's part. So, do we protect sites or places? Does it make any difference? I mean, I guess we'll all be talking about this as we go through the waving around. All right. Yeah. I'll just carry on until otherwise instructed. Yeah. Okay. So that's the kind of landscape that I think is there. And I might say at this moment, it applies to all archaeological sites, not just rock art sites. This is not something that is a feature of rock. People in the past were making places out of spaces all the time. And some of them by painting, some of them by living in other ways. Some of them by repetitively living and creating deep deposits. I mean, think about Deep Kloof or Sibudu or all of these sites that are very well known now because they're part of the story of the origins of modern people. There's something very interesting about placemaking going on with those sites. But it's quite hard to study. Anyway, maybe it's not the... I have to say, I carry my Bible around with me. It's a book by Keith Basso. It's called Wisdom Sits in Places. A lot of you probably know it. It's a fantastic book. Read it, and it's like going to rock painting sites. I keep going back and I find more. Right? Keith Basso was a cultural geographer, cultural anthropologist who went to work amongst the Western Apache, and he realized very early on that the maps that he brought along to use were of no interest to the people he was talking with. They couldn't relate to them. They weren't interested in what's on them. They were not maps that they could relate to. And he set about making such maps. And he realized that what he had was a bit of a measles map like I have, but instead of rock painting sites, these were place names and stories that were attached to those place names. And it, you know, he has a pedigree going back to Heidegger and Tim Ingold, all the classic kind of phenomenology, genealogy, right? And it's really interesting because what he managed to do was to create maps that had meaning for the people he was talking with. And those maps were mapped memories. They were. He explains why he uses the word wisdom for what was on those maps. It was the wisdom about how to be an Apache, how to be who you are. It was about, and he illustrates this, I think, really nicely by telling the story of a young man who lost his way. He started getting drunk. He started making inappropriate remarks to older women. He lost his girlfriend. He was in a mess, right? And 3 older Apache cowboys took him in hand. But they didn't lecture him. They didn't give him a book. Hey, you know, you're not, you know. What did they do? In a very interesting way, which Keith Basso describes here, they mention very casually to him around the fire 3 places, 3 place names. Now that young man, because he was part of the local cultural network, he knew exactly what they meant when they said the place where the stream goes down between 2 wires, whatever the place name was. He knew that they were referring to a story that was attached to that place. And when they'd done that 2 or 3 times, they said, okay, you know, I've got the message. And he went back and reputation. So, and I think maybe I need to say something about my attitude to ethnography here. Because why, you might say, what are you talking about? These are Western Apache. What have these got to do with, you know, rock painting sites in the Western Cape? I believe that hunter-gatherer ethnography is a fantastic residue, a fantastic harvest, treasure trove of stories about how hunter-gatherer people behave. I'm not saying they all behave the same. I'm saying that there is a lot of commonality in hunter-gatherer ways of seeing one another, behaving between one another and between themselves and their landscape. And I think that's why I put great store on this. So, for instance, if we look at this painting, this is Royden's tracing. Royden Yates was another with Tony and myself doing the recording in the 80s in the Western Cape. That's a painting we visited lots of times. That's Royden's tracing of it. What is the wisdom that's in this painting? And that's why I think gender and life history events are so important. They are a very, very significant feature of the paintings in this area. It's not all about gender or all about life history, but there are an enormous number of paintings which are best interpreted, in my view, dare I say, gazing and guessing, right, are about life history and gender. That's what and I've written quite a lot about this over the years. And so I think that this painting, which Royden has now managed to enhance by photographing and then enhancing the photographs. You go up to the site, it's quite faint. Royden managed to trace it brilliantly. But then he photographed and he enhanced the photographs, and there's more and more becoming visible. I mean, everybody's doing this. I'm not, there's nothing, I can tell you, Royden's doing it better than anybody, but that's just me, he's a friend of mine. But we're getting a lot more out of it than we saw 10 years ago. And 10 years ago, we thought we knew a lot more about it than we had 30 years before that. We're going back, we're seeing more and more detail. And we're starting to understand the detail. We don't understand the detail because we stare very carefully at the detail, but we do. It's very important to stare very carefully and do whatever enhancement you can. But you need to bring something to that detailed understanding of what the painter actually painted. And that has to do with the kind of ethnographies. Blake and Lloyd, the Blake and Lloyd archive is obviously extremely important. It's mid-19th century, but it is people who had until recently been hunting and gathering. It's a very, very valuable document. And Sharka knows that better than me because he's working on it at the moment there. But but I believe that there are many other ethnographies which can provide that kind of insight. Now, what I've just described is not science. None of you thought it was, probably. You know, you talk to a biologist or a chemist, or that's not what they do. What we do is more historical, anthropological. It's more a kind of a development. We do try and eliminate the less likely hypotheses. Of course we do. But it's very difficult to do that in archaeology, actually. And what you get then, as any of you who've read the archaeological literature will know, is you get two competing hypotheses sitting out there being argued by different archaeologists for 30 years. No problem. Probably happens in Europe as well. I mean, so there you go. Anyway, so I think, you know, what is the wisdom behind here? I think it's about men's roles. It's about women's relationships to men. It's about obligations at marriage. It's about hunting prowess. It's about eland. It's about the signification of the cloak, because you'll see that at the back of the top row, most of those men cloaked, whereas the few figures at the front are naked. I think this, if you go to the ethnographic literature and you look at the mostly written in German, the ethnographies in northern Namibia, southern Angola, in the 1920s. This is a dead ringer of those descriptions. I think this is a statement about male initiation, but it's probably about a lot of other things as well. The other Bible, if you like, is another wonderful book. I bought it in 1986 and I didn't start to read it until about 20 years after that. It's a book called The American Indian and the Problem of History. Note, the problem is with history, not with the American Indian, right? And it's a collection of papers by North American ethnographers, historians, many of them Native American people. And it's basically about how the Native American people have been misunderstood, misrepresented, misidentified. Pippa Scottness would say miscast, right? As rather poor versions of Europeans. Of course they're not. You know, they're rather good examples of Native Americans. And so you know, the problem of translation of archives, and I would say understanding of paintings as well, has to do with the fact that you're actually looking at a kind of collision, a juxtaposition of two different minds, not two different languages, you know, and often, I mean, okay, I'm sure you all know about Blake and Lloyd, but there's Lucy Lloyd sitting in a room in Cape Town in 1865, let's say, and she's got a chap with her and they're having a conversation, and she's with great trouble and admirably has learned his language so she can translate his words. But it's becoming increasingly clear that her real problem was understanding his mind. And we are just incredibly lucky that Lucy Lloyd made that effort and didn't try and do the translation of mind while she was doing the translation of words. She put it down. He said that. There it is. We're really fortunate. Yeah. And so what came out of this is the whole notion that the binaries that we take for granted, the binary between culture and nature, the binary between animal and human, are not necessarily there in the person we're talking to. When Lucy Lloyd was sitting in that room in Cape Town, one of the guys was telling her that he was telling her a story of an elderly man who was looking after his granddaughter. He was down a hole digging honey, and she was sitting on the surface. He couldn't see her, but he was kind of passing her some of this honey, and he could kind of tell it was her because of her response, but he couldn't see her. And then, and this informant is telling Lucy Lloyd, and then the elephants came by and they took the little girl, they stole the little girl, and they left one of their own little girls in her place. So at this point, even Lucy Lloyd had to say, well, hang on a sec, you know, this doesn't sound, you know, what do you mean? The elephants came by and stole the girl. And so this man said to her, that's when elephants were people. Now, he didn't mean they were people. You know, what he meant was that then there was no distinction between elephants and people, I think. Right? And scholars of the Blake and Lloyd archive are continually looking at this, and maybe Siaka has something to say about this. So it's not that this was an elephant that could become a people or a people that could become an elephant. This was something that was both all the time. And we've now, in the way the literature has gone now, we know that what triggers these changes is performative, right? In certain circumstances, elephants behave like people. They're still elephants. So Pippa is Pippa Scottness, the best person I've read on this notion of not talking about one thing becoming another, but about being them both at the same time. Her inaugural lecture in 2010, you should read that. It's absolutely fantastic. So I got two Bibles, right? And what I believe, not science, but because I read these things and they're persuasive to me, I believe that our hunter-gatherers who are making those paintings had that kind of world, had that kind of ontological understanding of who they were and how they differed from other animals. Very little, apparently, on occasion. And on the other hand, I believe that they had a relationship with their landscape which was interactive, with not only animals and plants that had agency, but places could have agency too. And so I think it's Keith Basso who says, he talks about interanimation. You animate the rock surfaces, and then they can feed back to you. So they can feed back who you are. You've put who you are there, and they can feed it back to you and remind you of it. One of the interesting things then, which I think Alice and I will talk about tomorrow, is that, of course, a lot has happened since the paintings were made. We're not, you know, we don't have those people. We might have descendants. We might have other hunter-gatherers in South America or in North America or in wherever, and we've got to do the best we can with those, which, by the way, is something that no physicist would ever say, right? We've got to do the best with it. No. So we've got a tough job. But those are my two Bibles. That's the way I'm looking at these paintings. Next point that I'd like to make, and I don't think this is difficult, and you probably all believe it anyway, is often when I'm standing in front of paintings and somebody says, well, tell me something about the circumstances under which these paintings were made, I'm really stuck because we don't really have that information. But we have a lot of information about stories. And I think there are huge parallels between stories and paintings. They're not the same. The story is not a written version of the painting. The painting is not an illustration of the story, but they're coming out of the same heads, and they are, as it were, answerable to the same ontological worldview. So I think it's very interesting that when you listen to, let's say, Megan Beasley or to Jose de Prada, when you listen to them talking about stories, it's like they were talking about paintings. Somebody's telling you apparently the same story as you heard 3 weeks ago, but it's got variability. It's not the same. Like our paintings are not the same. They appear to be paintings of the same kind of event. I'm a great believer in events. Not every rock art person is a great believer in events, but I do believe in those. I believe in the specificity of paintings. I believe in the specificity of events and painting. All right. And so you don't have time to read that now, but if you read their books, both of which have just come out in the last couple of years, are fantastic insights into what Megan calls, cultural expression, expressive culture, I think is the way she describes it, and I think we can learn a lot from those. So when we look at the paintings, we find that we can see some similarities between paintings. These paintings are all very close together along the same set of stream beds. And I think that in some sense, they're the same. I've got to make another acknowledgement here. I've become very uneasy about categories. I don't like categories. The very famous American archaeologist who said, half of our job is putting labels on things, the other half is taking them off. And he was absolutely right. We use a category, it's helpful for a while, then it's a bit of a millstone around our neck because somehow it's not telling us what we think we're seeing. So on. Okay, so look, these are, that's another of Royden's tracing. This is Lily. I don't think Lily's here yet, but she's coming. This is Lily's enhancement of Royden's tracing. So you can see what I mean when I say you can see a lot more in the photographic. This is another of Royden's tracing. That's the original up there. These are paintings of people sitting down. Often there's a single figure standing up, but they're mostly sitting down underneath a whole bunch of bags. I know you get them in other parts of Southern Africa. They're quite common. Tim Maggs first found these in the Western Cape, and he called them group scenes. And we still kind of informally use that term. But they're very, very variable. And it's a category that is stimulating for a while, but after a while, we have to start noticing the differences rather than the similarities here. And so that one at the top middle there, that was called by Tim and Haim, who first found it, that was called Treason Trial, because Nelson Mandela and the others had just gone on trial, and they looked at that painting, gaze and guess, right? And they said, oh, there's a jail. That's a jail window at the top there. You see that little square thing with some lines on it? These are some people under a jail. They're in jail. It's a treason trial. Well, it isn't, of course. And that's a bag up there, almost certainly. Where does he get this authority from? He keeps saying it is a... Anyway, leave it. It's a bag. And those are people sitting down. And you can see the bags, the kinds of bags, the variety of bags, women's bags, men's bags, sometimes only men's bags, I don't think only ever women's bags, but anyway, there's something going on. those painters are trying to tell us something. I think it's about belonging. I think it's about it's about being at home. And it may have been stimulated because for some reason they were suddenly feeling not at home. It may have something to do with the appearance of pastoralists in the area, and you know, leading people to be somewhat less comfortable. So this is what we're doing. We're looking at the elements. We're looking at these cloaks. There's some more cloaks. You know, we're looking at the bags. We're looking at the organization. We're doing the same kind of things with animal figures, of course, as well. Or take these. Lines of figures where you can only find women. I mean, at first, you know, like everybody else, women breasts, right? Men penises, okay. Anything else, indeterminate. After a while, we realized there were lots of ways in which the painters were indicating women or men. It didn't only have to do with primary or secondary sexual characteristics. It was other parts of the body. It was equipment. It was associations, all kinds of things. I'm not telling you anything that all rock art people in Southern Africa have been through these kinds of sequences. But look, sometimes you know, you've got a couple of female figures with nothing else. Sometimes you've got a line of figures, and you've got some other imagery which might open up other kinds of interpretations to other kinds of people. Or you've got an association with elephants, or you've got a site where those lines of women only is replicated 4 or 5 times around the cave. And I think we can learn from that. We can learn by looking at the detail, but the detail itself, as I said, not gonna give you the answer. It might give you some interesting questions, and then you can go and see what you can gather, hopefully in the most relevant ethnography you can find, and as often as you can find. And lots of people have made lots of things about women and elephants, about crenulated lines and so on and so forth. Because obviously these are, I think, well, a few years ago I thought, wow, these Renaissance art historians have been working for years on paintings where they don't have the painter. They're trying to understand what's being painted. They've got some ethnography in the form of classical legends and rituals and so on. And so they're gazing and guessing, and they're making an interpretation. And, you know, this is what Gombrich says. He says, reality is too detailed to paint. So the artist uses conventional images that are real enough to recognize and are co-devised by artists and viewers over time, right? He calls them schemata. Or I've always liked Peter Garlake's phrase, the principle of legibility. People are not painting stuff to confuse you. You know, they're painting stuff that's meaningful to them. They don't know about you yet, of course. So you know, but it's that interaction between painter and viewer. We'll agree that a cloak looks like that, they'll say. Okay? I've been really impressed by Maria Wiebke Wiestad's book. It's fantastic, absolutely. And it has, by the way, some of those 1920s, 1930s stories about male initiation groups. So we get a lot of paintings like this in the all over South Africa. But okay, and it you know, there's lots of anyway. You see, there's a whole lot of men. Well, I would say men. Why? They got clothes. Right? They haven't got penises because they're wearing cloaks. Right? That's a problem. Not considerable, but a problem. And they've got a set of standardized equipment that I think is a way of saying much more about men that I can understand. And look at and here's an interesting issue. We never quite know which bit of detail is telling something to us that we didn't know before, or whether it's just. But look at that. Those first few bows, the bowstring is on the right-hand side. Come along, but you'll see that at the back, the back four men, let me call them men, it's the other way around. I don't know whether that means anything. I have no idea. I haven't got there yet. Maybe I'll never get there. You know, that's what we do. We notice things, and we try and deal with them. Often, also, it's not only lines of men. It does have men with those cloaks and with the quiver and so on and so forth. But there'll be a woman or a naked man in the line. And so we've got to say, well, because as Gombrich was trying to point out to us, these are just bits of information that go into a much more complicated whole. These are things that can be recombined in various ways in the paintings. I'd be very interested. I was talking a bit with Bill Rain and Justine earlier. It'd be really interesting to know how these recombinations and so on vary across space. And very few rock art people I may be wrong here, but I think it would be fair to say very few rock art people in Southern Africa are familiar enough with several of these regional painting sets to really make that kind of analysis. I know it's on the to-do list at the moment of various people. And then here's another interesting painting. This is a line of human figures. Now, almost always, if I'm right about identifying men and women, almost always they're either men or they're women, but sometimes they're not. And in this case here, lovely line of lovely line of figures. But it's very easy to see how male and female figures are being distinguished. And it's very important to the viewer, to the painter, that you don't get things wrong. So it could be shoulders facing front. That's okay for a man because he's supposed to have nice shoulders, so you can show that. Not so good for a woman. Sideways, rests, right? So these are composite images that are put together. This is classic Peter Garley, I think, where and it's a wonderful case where the perspective is being manipulated to make the point. I will say that I've spent a lot of time, about 30 years now, thinking about gender and about how strongly, whether I'm not applying to these paintings my own view. I actually wrote to as many anthropologists as I could find, and I said, look, when you're describing this apparently quite gendered behavior in the Kalahari, do you think maybe, oh, sorry. You think maybe you were missing something, or were you seeing something but not wanting to record it? Could there have been a less bimodal, that's not the word I'm looking for, is it? But anyway, the word. Is it, and I didn't get really any responses saying that they thought that was the case. So I believe, I'm just going to say what I believe here. I believe that there are various binaries which are not adhered to, or which were not in the belief system of hunter-gatherers, but I think the male-female one was. That's my view. And then you get cloaks that are joined together like this. Is this this is a gang of men, it's what, and they've got great calves, right? Anybody, and I mean anybody, would be proud to have legs like that, right? And I've been, I know that in the Blake and Lloyd literature, there is a mention of calves, or there are one or two mentions of calves. Men are going to have to run after that eland for 5 days. They've got to have good calves. You know, they've got to be good runners. Anyway. But what's that guy doing on the left? He's got his own cloak. Is he special? Occasionally, when you find these lines of men, you do find somebody who's drawn out of it. And again, if you read those German ethnographies, you can find explanations for that. Another of Royden's tracing. And then, you know, these cloaks drift off into these kinds of things. I think it was Bill Rain saying you wanted to come to the Cape and see some nice paintings. This would be an obvious site. It's an amazing place. And it's got all these figures. And at first sight, it looks like people wearing cloaks, but there are no legs. Are these dead people? Are these people who are wearing their cloak, but the cloak has been stitched up around them? Are they dead people? What? I don't know. Why are two of them in one sleeping bag? Huh? Even more difficult, why is one snake-like? You know, so the cloak is only a first insight into the meaning of this very, very complicated painting. Now, just to say something about management, this site is way up a hill. It's really difficult to get to. It's in relatively good condition. I'm pretty sure that we can say that the only changes in these paintings have come about naturally through age and natural deterioration. I don't think there's much. It's not the case for all paintings, and I think Alice and I will say something about this tomorrow. And then at Zimri's shelter, which is quite a famous shelter now, there are more interesting. So they're using the cloak notion schema in Gombrich's term, and they're using it in collaboration with other schemas, some of which we have an idea about, some of which we have no idea about, and making quite. So I just want to end up here by saying, which I've already said, that I think that these paintings are individual events. I mean, I don't believe that people are painting male initiation. Painters are male initiation. See, they're painting that one, and that one. And I bet that those men who went past that cave and that painting said, "Let me. I'm the third from the right." I believe there's a kind of specificity there. I believe that these are eyes on the past, like. They're all telling us a little bit about the past. Probably to put them together, which I do think gives us a very interesting management issue. I'm going to